Ready for a good scare? I have for you 5, truly, terrifying horror stories that are most definitely sure to give you nightmares. But before we begin, you know what to do. Yes. I love it when people like and subscribe. Enjoy the following nightmare fuel. The Ouija board is a board game that is said to enable users to communicate with spirits or the dead. Its history dates back to the late 19th century when spiritualism was a popular movement in Europe and North America. Spiritualists believed that the living could communicate with the dead through mediums, or individuals who were sensitive to the spirits. The Ouija board was originally created as a tool to assist mediums in their communication with spirits. The first Ouija board was patented by Elijah Bond in 1890 and was sold as a game to be played by groups of people, often at parties or in seances. However, as the use of the Ouija board became more popular, it began to be used by people outside of the spiritualist movement. Many people believed that the Ouija board was a way to communicate with the dead without the need for a medium. This led to an increase in its use, especially during the early part of the 20th century. Unfortunately, the misuse of the Ouija board and the seances that often accompanied it led to many incidents of fraud, as well as cases of emotional distress and even mental illness. Some people claimed that the Ouija board could be used to predict the future or to communicate with malevolent spirits, which led to fears about its use. In the mid-20th century, the Ouija board became associated with horror movies and stories about demonic possession, further contributing to its reputation as a tool for the supernatural. While some people still use the Ouija board as a form of entertainment or as a spiritual tool, its history of misuse and association with the occult has led to many people avoiding it altogether. But that's only half of it. Séances have been a popular practice for communicating with the dead since the mid-19th century. Originally, séances were intended to be a form of spiritualism, where participants would gather together to communicate with spirits through a medium. However, as the popularity of séances grew, so did the potential for misuse and manipulation. In the early days of séances, many mediums were accused of fraud, using various tricks and techniques to fool participants into believing they were communicating with the dead. These mediums would use techniques such as hidden wires, sleight of hand, and even pre-arranged signals with accomplices to make their séances seem more authentic. As séances became more popular, they also became a popular form of entertainment. Many people would attend séances simply for the thrill of communicating with the dead, and some mediums would play up the drama and theatrics to keep their audiences engaged. Unfortunately, the misuse of séances didn't stop there. In some cases, séances were used for more sinister purposes, such as scamming people out of their money or manipulating vulnerable individuals. There were also cases where séances were used to spread false information or prop up certain political or social agendas. Overall, the history of séance misuse is a cautionary tale about the potential dangers of blindly following popular trends and the importance of being critical and skeptical of any claims made by self-proclaimed mediums or spiritualists. However, fake or not, these involvements prove otherwise. Here are 5 truly terrifying tales about what happens when summoning the dead goes awry. Enjoy! Story number 1. Submitted by Pixel Guru 23. The Physical Apparition. It started innocently enough. A group of friends and I decided to play with a Ouija board. We had heard all the warnings, of course, but we were young and foolish. We thought it would be fun. At first, nothing happened. We asked the usual questions: is anyone there? Can you hear us? But the planchette remained still. We were about to give up when suddenly, it began to move. We were all excited at first. It was thrilling to think that we were communicating with something beyond this world. But that excitement quickly turned to terror. The spirit we were communicating with seemed angry. It spelled out strange messages that made no sense to us. It seemed to know things about us, things we had never told anyone. And then, one night, things took a dark turn. I woke up to find the planchette moving on its own. I could hear whispers in the darkness, whispers that chilled me to the bone. I tried to leave the room, but the door wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding it shut. That's when I saw her. A ghostly figure, hovering in the air. Her eyes were hollow, her skin a sickly gray. She reached out to me, and I felt a cold, icy grip on my arm. I don't remember much after that. I woke up the next morning, drenched in sweat, with bruises on my arms. But the worst was yet to come. The haunting continued, night after night. I saw things I could not explain. I heard voices that were not of this world. I felt a presence in my room, a presence that filled me with dread. In the end, I had no choice but to seek help. I contacted a priest, who came to bless my home. It took hours, but finally, The spirit was gone. But I will never forget that terrifying experience. I will never forget the fear that consumed me, the fear of the unknown. And I will never, ever touch a Ouija board again. Story number 2. Submitted by Macabre Muse. The Twisted Medium. I remember that night vividly. It was a dark and stormy evening, and I had reluctantly agreed to attend a séance with some friends. I had always been skeptical of these sorts of things, but I figured it would be a fun way to spend the night. The séance took place in an old, abandoned house on the outskirts of town. As we entered the musty room, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease wash over me. The atmosphere was thick with an eerie energy that seemed to pulse through the air. The medium leading the séance was a thin, gaunt woman with dark circles under her eyes. She led us in a series of chants and incantations, her voice growing louder and more frenzied with each passing moment. I could feel a sense of dread building inside me, like something terrible was about to happen. Suddenly, it happened. A loud crash echoed through the room, and the candles flickered and went out. I could hear the panicked breathing of my friends around me, and I realized I was holding my breath. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand wrap around my ankle, and I screamed in terror. I looked down to see a pale, ghostly figure rising up from the floor, its eyes fixed on me. I could feel its icy breath on my face as it whispered my name. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. The figure began to pull me down into the darkness, and I could feel myself slipping away. I was certain that I was going to die, that I was going to be lost in the abyss forever. And just as soon as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The candles flickered back to life, and the medium stood up, her face twisted in a cruel smile. "That was fun, wasn't it?" she cackled. I stumbled out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. As I walked back to my car, I realized that something had changed in me. Something had been awakened that night, something dark and terrifying. I knew that I would never be the same again. If you're enjoying the content so far, please, be kind and smash that like and subscribe button. It's good for the channel. Now, back to the show. Story number 3. Submitted by Ghostly Gaze. The Ghost Trap Mishap. I've always been fascinated by the paranormal, so when my friend suggested we use a Ouija board, I was more than excited to try it out. We gathered at her house one night, lit a few candles, and began our spooky adventure. We placed our fingertips on the planchette and asked if there were any spirits present. To our surprise, the planchette started moving. At first, we were all skeptical, thinking that one of us was moving it, but then the messages we received were so accurate and specific that we knew something was happening. We asked the spirit who it was and what it wanted, and it spelled out M-U-R-D-E-R-E-R. At that moment, I felt a chill run down my spine, but my friend insisted that we keep going. We continued asking questions, and the answers we received were becoming more and more disturbing. Suddenly, the planchette started moving faster and faster, and we could barely keep up. We asked the spirit to leave, but it refused to stop. Then, out of nowhere, the candles flickered, and the room went pitch black. We could hear a low, guttural growling sound coming from the board, and we knew something had gone wrong. We quickly said goodbye to the spirit and threw the board into the closet, hoping that it would stop the chaos. But the growling continued, and we heard footsteps coming closer and closer. In a panic, we ran out of the house and into the street, trying to catch our breath. As we looked back, we saw a shadowy figure standing at the window, watching us. After that night, I never touched a Ouija board again. I learned my lesson the hard way: sometimes, it's best to leave the paranormal alone. Story number 4. Submitted by Cyber Phoenix 13. The Faint Whisper. I've often wondered about the afterlife, so when my friend suggested we hold a séance, I was more than excited to try it out. We gathered at her house one night, lit a few candles, and began our spooky adventure. We all sat in a circle around a table, holding hands and chanting. We asked if there were any spirits present, but nothing happened for what felt like an eternity. Suddenly, I felt a chill run down my spine. I looked around the room, and the candles flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I could feel a presence in the room, but it wasn't like anything I had ever felt before. Then, we heard a faint whisper. It was almost inaudible, but we all heard it. We asked the spirit to speak up, and it did. The spirit began to speak in a raspy voice, and we could feel its breath on our faces. The words were jumbled, and it was hard to understand, but we kept listening. The more the spirit spoke, the more agitated it became. It started to knock the table around, and the candles started to flicker more intensely. Suddenly, it felt like the room was alive with energy, and the air became thick and suffocating. As we sat there in terror, the room grew darker and darker until we could barely see each other's faces. Suddenly, a loud, guttural growl filled the room, and the table flew across the room. We screamed in terror and ran out of the house. I could feel the spirit's presence following us, and it felt like it was getting closer and closer. When we finally got to safety, we all collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. From that day forward, I knew that I never wanted to have anything to do with a seance again. The terror and horror that I experienced that night will stay with me for the rest of my life. Story number 5. Submitted by Night Owl 10. The terrifying lesson. I've always been a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal. I mean, a Parker Brothers game that can conjure the dead? But when my friends suggested we try using the Ouija board, I thought it would be a fun experiment. We gathered at my friend's house one night, lit a few candles, and began our adventure. We placed our fingertips on the planchette, and my friend asked if there were any spirits present. To my surprise, the planchette started moving. At first, I thought one of my friends was playing a prank on me, but the messages we received were too accurate and specific for it to be a joke. As we continued to ask questions, I could feel the energy in the room start to shift. It was like the air was thick with anticipation, and I found myself getting more and more curious about what was happening. Suddenly, the planchette started moving faster and faster, and we could barely keep up. The messages we received were becoming more and more erratic, and it felt like something was trying to communicate with us. Then, without warning, the candles flickered, and the room went pitch black. I could hear my friend screaming in terror, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. Suddenly, a chill ran down my spine, and I could feel a presence in the room with us. The air felt heavy, and it was hard to breathe. It was like something was watching us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we had made a huge mistake. We quickly said goodbye to the spirit and threw the board into the closet, hoping that it would stop the chaos. We sat in silence for a few moments, catching our breath and trying to process what had just happened. As we left the house that night, I couldn't help but feel like we had opened a door that we shouldn't have. The Ouija board had left me with more questions than answers. There's one thing for certain. Ouija boards are real and aren't to be toyed with. So, there you have it. 5 truly terrifying horror stories that are most definitely sure to give you nightmares. I hope you enjoyed the show. Come back for more ghoulish tales from true experiences more terrifying than the minds of Stephen King and Edgar Allan Poe. And thank you for watching. Goodbye. Till next time. Take care of yourselves, and love one another.